webcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Exempt and Non-Exempt Employees, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Amanda Ramatar, and I will be your moderator today, and I'll be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discuss can be found at the URL currently showing on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. If you have audio difficulties or telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternate call-in number. Please feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will try to work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenter will be answering questions throughout the presentation. And lastly, we have a number of upcoming webinars covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory preventing harassment training in English 3 times per year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, Exempt and Non-Exempt Employees, where you will learn about FMLA overtime, travel time, leaves of absence, and other important distinctions between the two classes of employees. Today's interactive session will be facilitated by CJ Westrick. CJ has been in Human Resources Management for over 25 years and received her Senior Professional in Human Resources National Certification in 2002. She started HR Jungle in 2006 and targets companies that want senior-level HR expertise on a part-time basis. HR Jungle provides business owners and management teams workable solutions and hands-on assistance with employees and legal compliance through outsourced HR services. Thank you for being with us today, CJ.
Thank you. Now, can you see my screen?
Yes, it looks good. Thanks.
Sorry, gang. We had some technical issues this morning. And all right, so today we're going to talk about the definitions that are used, the penalties involved, and the exemptions themselves. And I always like to kick off something like this with what's in the news that is related to this particular topic. It's a big one because this is federal law. AT&T has settled for $28 million because it had put its first-level managers exempt, and therefore they didn't pay overtime, and they got sued for it. City Gear LLC was accused of withholding over $25 million in overtime for store managers and assistant managers. They pay on a fixed salary basis, but whenever the manager or assistant manager works less than the mandatory 45-hour work week, they actually prorate their paycheck accordingly. They subtract for the time they didn't work. And so they got sued for that. Alaska Communication Systems Group, they misclassified their client account managers and their account executives and senior managers as exempt. And in 2018, court certified this as a class action, and now it's looking back to 2010. And the case is still pending, but look at how long they're going back. Even in 2018, that was looking back 8 years at that time. These things take a long time and through the courts, and the penalties can be huge because usually the company has no defense, really, when it comes down to it. There's no time cards or anything like that. So let's talk about the different exemptions available. There is the executive, administrative, professional, outside sales, commissioned inside sales, and the computer professional. And we're going to go through each of those. So, but first we're going to do our first polling question.
Thank you, CJ. One moment. How much weight does the title carry in determining if the employee is exempt or non-exempt? We like to usually have about 80% of our audience before we close the polling question. So we love when everybody's interactive with us.
One reason I ask this question is simply because there's so many people that assume a title is the definition.
Okay, so we're getting close to 80% now. So here are the results. 12% say 25%, 19% say 50%, 13% say 100%, and 56% say none.
Well, thanks for that 56%, because the title means nothing when you come to making a decision on exempt versus non-exempt. And you won't find titles as one of the duties tests or one of the testing things that the exemptions have. In fact, the government, whether it's a state government or the federal government, you could have even the CEO be hourly, non-exempt. The title means nothing. It's all about, there's two parts to this. It is about the money and it's about the testing that each exemption carries. So when we look at a non-exempt employee, basically the way it's looked at in court and by the government, so whoever's doing your audit, doing the auditing, they ignore the title. Instead, they're assuming everyone is non-exempt, and it's up to the company to prove otherwise. So in an ideal world, you're providing a written justification that you can keep on file on why you found this person to be qualified to be exempt. If you are needing to do an audit of your employees and their titles and whatnot, it's very smart to do it with under the umbrella of your company attorney, because that way, if a couple years down the road somebody's suing you, and if you don't have it under the attorney where it's client attorney privilege, then all of a sudden it can be pulled up in the court records and they're saying, well, wait, you looked at this 2 years ago and you didn't correct it back then, so we're going to slap you just a little bit harder. Whereas if it's under the attorney, whether or not frankly, it doesn't even have to be an employment law attorney, but that's always recommended so that you're getting good advice on this particular topic. But to have it under there, that way they can't show what you found out previously and chose not to correct. Because I have had companies that have chosen not to make the correction. So when we look at the definition of non-exempt, it's really everyone who hasn't met an exemption test. So you're paying for overtime, and when that overtime hits varies by state. You must meet your state minimum wage rules, and if the state doesn't have any specific to itself, you're meeting federal minimum wage rules, which they're looking at increasing. And then, the company controls the hours. You can say you must work 8 to 5, and you can take an hour for lunch, or you must, do this or that. And an exempt person, you don't really have that same level of control. So when you're looking at an exempt person, the whole point of the exempt versus non-exempt language is that they are exempt from overtime pay. That's how they came up with this. And so you're really looking at they're exempt from the overtime pay. If you're in a state like California where it's got these required meal and rest breaks, they're exempt from that. I always joke and say, exempt people, the government doesn't care if you ever sleep or eat, but with your non-exempt, they absolutely care. And that's where you're going to get hit. So hours for an exempt person are not counted or comped. You can't say, oh, because I worked on Sunday, I'm going to go ahead and take Monday off. It doesn't work. There is no comp time legally so much. So you're looking at something else. And I actually worked with a CEO whose definition of an exempt employee is, look, I've got this big box of responsibilities, and authority that I'm going to turn over to you in exchange for this big box of cash I'm giving you. And that's what it was. It was like, it is a trade-off. You're paying this person to do a job. So it pays to actually have a good job description for an exempt person, because you can't really tell them, oh, you can't work 7 hours a day. I mean, a lot of companies do, but legally they've got more freedom than a non-exempt does. But they must meet the salary minimum, and for whatever exemption you're using, and they must meet the duties test. And the duties test is the one that ends up being discussed the most. The money is kind of black and white in my mind, but the duties test can be very subjective, and it gets really messy at times. One of the big things an exempted person is supposed to have is, they've always got this, and of course everybody goes, well, what does that mean? They're supposed to customarily and regularly exercise discretion and independent judgment. In my mind, when I talk about this, it's about a certain level of authority. You know, does this person have the authority to sign a $10,000 contract for the company? Are they able to make these decisions or make a policy on their own? Now, I know it's never 100% on their own. They might need senior management approval of a new policy or something like that, but they're the ones that are going to bring it in and suggest it and give the reasoning for it. But, you know, there's somebody who really it's funny because as you move up the ladder in a corporation, you actually do less physical work and more mental work. And that's why they're talking about discretion and judgment. As you can move up into exempt level positions, you're expected to be able to bring your experience and your judgment with you and to make some decisions about what's going on. And these do vary with each exemption a little bit. Some are very much the same. So let's start with the executive exemption. This is key personnel. So this is usually going to be like your C-level people and your VPs, to where they're running something. They're running the company, or they're in charge of a whole department. They do say that typically it's going to be someone who manages at least 2 full-time employees. And some of this is being looked at by the feds. I know a few years back, they actually threw out the question, well, if you only manage 2 people, what happens when one goes on vacation? Now you're only managing 1 person. So have you lost your exemption for that week? And it's a good question. You know, the concept is that when these were first developed, is that it was a much higher level person than what I see in a lot of companies now. So it is someone who's got the power to hire and to fire and to change the status of an employee. And that's why I said they've got to be somebody who has good judgment, you know, or uses their judgment and has some discretion. And, you know, it's like a VP wants to be able to say, we're going to, you know, I'm firing this person. They might talk to HR about the process, but they're not going to go necessarily and get permission from the CEO. The CEO's given them the authority over their department. So you look at some of the duties, they've got to be spending at least 50% of their time on exempt and related duties. So that's the hiring, the training, the evaluating and firing employees, controlling the flow and distribution of whatever the product is or the service is. They're planning and directing the work of others. They're setting pay rates and hours. So it is someone who's in charge, and the executive isn't used, I don't see it used badly as a rule, because usually it is only going to be like C-level VPs and up. And so that one kind of stays, I think it's easier for people to understand. The administrative one is the one where I see it's used and abused much more often. It's the most common one, and that's probably why. And the office work is, we're doing office work that's directly related to managing policies or the general business operations, or for those of your customers. They do have that discretion and independent judgment, maybe not to the level that the executive would have, but they do have a certain level of it. They can certainly come in and say, I'm planning to fire Joe. Do you have any problem with that? Staff employees who are functional rather than department heads may also be administratively exempt, because it might be something who is using specialized training or experience or knowledge, like something like a manager of HR might be under the administrative exemption, simply because even if they don't have a big HR department, they are managing HR for the whole company. And so that's seen, carrying a little bit more weight. Let's move to our next polling question.
Is your executive assistant or administrative assistant exempt? So we're getting some responses now. Looks like we're at about 50%, 60%. Thank you for participating. And we're almost at 80%, just a few more. All right, I think we're close enough. So 19% say yes, 66% say no, and 15% say only the executive assistant.
All right. And what I'll say there is that often when it says an assistant in there, it's not necessarily going to qualify as exempt. And administrative assistants, these are titles that started years and years ago. An executive assistant, back when this started, was truly that right-hand person to the owner or the CEO of the company. If the CEO was out sick, that person could make decisions for them on their behalf. It wasn't we'll call it more secretarial style that we see now. And that's why it's been so misused. And, because an administrative assistant is doing administrative things and they might be making some decisions, but they're working within a box. And so normally they're not really making their own decisions. They're making, they're choosing from what the company's given them to choose from, but they're not out there creating a policy on their own or running something else. They're doing the work for whoever their boss is as a rule, but not in lieu of their boss. So it gets really tricky on this one. And, we spoke about some of the administrative duties. So exempt duties would be advising management, planning or strategizing something that's going to happen, negotiating deals with, for, outside vendors. You're representing the company in some way. You've got signing authority when purchasing materials and supplies. And I'm not talking like a receptionist who can have a $500 limit when she's ordering supplies. It's truly you're able to sign off on a contract for the company. You might be promoting sales or doing researching business opportunities, analyzing business data, and determining company and or personnel policies. So these are what they're considering, something that's a little bit more exempt, where it does make you have to analyze the situation and come up with appropriate answers. Some examples that they've given is an exempt person might be a financial consultant working for a firm, because they go out and actually consult with clients, and so they're on their own as far as coming up with answers. An accounting manager, that's usually somebody who has people working under them. An HR manager, as I mentioned. What's typically not going to show up as exempt is someone who's got a supervisor on their name, or an office manager even, or that executive or administrative assistant. And again, this goes because they're doing, we'll call it routine stuff. The supervisor typically is following the orders from a manager who told him, oh, go make sure these guys do something. It's like having a lead on a project or something. It's not necessarily that they're making a lot of decisions on their own. Office manager, the same thing. They might be keeping your office running smoothly and order office supplies and things for you, but it's still very much, we'll call it no big decision making or no big authority. Now it depends. There might be some office managers who do have a higher level of role in the company, and because the names, the titles can vary so much, and the executive or administrative assistant these days doesn't mean what it first did. So a lot of times that person is not going to be considered exempt. They're not spending 50% of their time making decisions doing those exempt duties. Moving on to our third polling question.
Is a manager with 2 employees always exempt? And CJ, we actually have a question for you, and I believe it's in regards to the examples of exempt positions. Someone asked, what about school teachers and trainers?
When you say trainers, it's like, I don't know if that means like in an educational environment, since they mentioned, school teachers. We will get to some of that when we hit professional exemption, and you can see what they're looking at there. But trainers, if you're talking someone who's doing like physical training, all the physical trainers that are out there these days, not necessarily, because again, they're not, it kind of depends. I mean, and that's why the titles are so unimportant, because it's really not about the title, because what one company calls a manager over here could mean something completely different to this other company. And that's why the title itself is very dangerous. Instead, you really want to look deep at the exemptions themselves to see if, it mentions, because the federal government does put out these explanations. They're not as good as we would like in some cases, because we want that detail, like give us a black and white answer here. And it never does that, because it has to cover such a broad range of industries with using different titles. But as far as the professional exemption, we will get to that, and we'll see if that answers the question. And if not, hopefully that person will ask again something with a little more detail then.
Thank you. Awesome. And then for the results of our polling question, we have 12% say yes, 79% say no, and 9% say not sure.
All right. And as a rule, you can't just rely on the fact that they're managing others, because it really depends on what level of management that is. If I say, it's like, go on a construction site, you've got somebody who is a project manager, you've got the foreman, you've got the lead, and and the lead is actually leading a group of people there, but it's never going to qualify as exempt, because he's just making sure the work's getting done. And a lot of times, that's one of the biggest dangers with looking at the title so much, is what is that management of those people? Did they, play the heavier role in hiring that person and in firing that person? Do they have the performance management conversations with them? Or are they just leading the workflow that day? And so you can't just rely on the two employees. It helps if you're getting close to one of the other exemptions, one of the exemptions where it might fit. But just having that, because part of that, one thing is kind of to give some thought of the money. That's one reason the federal government is looking to increase minimum salaries. I know several years ago they tried to bring up the minimum salaries nationwide to, it was like 47,764, some weird number, but it was over 47,000. The states in the southern, mostly southeastern areas, cried foul, because it's like, oh my gosh, they were getting by with paying making somebody exempt for like 21,000, it was under 22,000, because of the way the exempt money works. And so that would be more than double of what they'd already been paying some exempt people. And so, with the differences, whereas you've got California, right now the minimum salary is like over 50, almost 55,000. And so from California's side, because they have, higher minimum wages, and that's how it's calculated, having the feds increase it doesn't affect them. It does affect people in a lot of other states, though, and that's where the federal government's trying to make people recognize that it needs to be a higher level position. So don't rely on it just being because they manage two people. You really have to look at the duties. And working managers is a perfect example of that. How many times have you seen Starbucks get sued for employment issues? And one of them has been because their their shift manager is also acting as a barista and doing the work. They have some management duties, but they're spending more than 50% of their time doing the same work as everybody else that they're managing. That's when you start losing that exemption. They aren't supposed to be, doing the same work and just providing a little guidance. That's not an exempt level position. So, if they're only managing a few people, but they're still spending at least 50% of their time doing the same work, it's considered a working manager, and you could even have that title, but it's not going to qualify as exempt. And there are managers, people with manager titles, who are still non-exempt because just the way the company hierarchy flows. And so you want to consider what is their true management duties, what's going on there. What is the frequency of their discretion and independent judgment they're using? If it's only like once every 6 months, it's like, gosh, should I let this person go home early or not? I mean, that's not an intense, discretionary judgment call there. And are they relatively free from supervision? And even then, it's kind of like, how big is the box they're sitting in? And then you're looking at, comparative compensation. Exempt people often get better perks, better benefits, definitely better wages as a rule. So the professional exemption, the one that somebody was kind of asking about, this is where there's 3 categories within this one. It does have a salary test associated, and so do the other 2. Hold on, let me see when I'm talking about the money part. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it right now. The salary test for most exemptions is based on your state minimum wage. So if your state, and I am not going to try to do the math in my head here, but if you look at the federal minimum, federal minimum wage, what they're doing on a federal basis, they're looking at, you look and take 2 times your minimum wage. So we'll do easy numbers. If your minimum wage is $10 an hour, so 2 times that, you're looking at $20 an hour. That's the minimum exempt person must be paid. But they take it one step further. It's based now, for an annual basis, it's based on 2,080 hours, which is considered a full-time person. So the feds have said, it's like, in this case, we'll say the 35,568. We don't care if that person only works 1 hour a month. Over the year, they must make $35,568. And so that's where a lot of times when I get so often where people, well, we're going to bring him in, but we're going to put him on salary. He's only going to work part-time. Well, he still has to make the full-time equivalent salary. And that they're very firm on. You drop $1 below that and you have lost that exemption. And where this really comes into a problem area is because I've seen too many times where a company pays the minimum required. And, like, okay, California, let's say we're 54,000. We'll pay 54,000 to this person. And they felt like they really squeezed out to get that 54,000 paid. But now, let's say they're not offering any paid vacation, or maybe they do. And this is a person who's taking a little more time off than what they've got, section for them. What happens? Most of the time, you've got someone who now, let's say they've used their 2 weeks of vacation. And you know what? I've got, bereavement. I've got to go take a few days off here. And the company doesn't pay for bereavement, but they'll pay for it now because you won't have any unpaid days off if you're paying the minimum. I don't care if they're out sick for 6 months. Well, okay, if they're on a leave of absence, there are exceptions there in how it's counted. But if the person's basically working for you the whole year and they're just taking an extra day or 2 off here, you can't not pay them if they're at the minimum. So typically, if like California's minimum is 54, I'm going to tell people, I tell my clients, if that position is not worth at least 60,000 to you, keep them hourly. Don't make them exempt, because you're going to end up butting into that, because the minimum wage, California is a perfect example of how this comes back to bite you. Is I've had a company that will make somebody exempt and they'll scrape by and get that minimum in there. But California has been adding $1 an hour to its minimum wage, trying to get it up to $15 an hour. That $1 an hour is representing nearly a $5,000 per year salary increase. So even though I'm saying, 60, next year I'll be saying, if that position's not worth 65,000 to you, because I want to stay above the minimum. And so it bounces up pretty fast if you've got a minimum wage that's increasing. And I know the federal government's talking about having some increases. A lot of states are looking at increasing. And, even California's has been going over this like 6-year process to get it up to 15. And, and so what happens though is that really, it basically right now where wage increases merit increases are pretty low. They're like, 2 to 3%. But if you've got an exempt person that's right along the bottom, you're giving them almost a 10% increase every year just to keep up the exempt salary requirement. So really take a hard look at that, because the money is very important, and it's the first thing that's going to bring you down if they're not paying. Because I still to this day run across new clients that are paying an exempt person $36,000 when the minimum is $54,000. So how do you reconcile that? Are you now going to pay this person like $50,000 to catch them up for the 2 years you had them as exempt? It's a problem, and you need to work at it. So the professional exemption has 3 categories: learned, licensed, and artistic. It does have a salary test included. Most of them do, and most of them follow the same salary test. So you have to look and make sure, if you're making them exempt, that they are meeting that salary requirement. So a learned professional is someone who basically had to get a degree in order to practice whatever their profession is. This is most often seen in law or medicine, theology, accounting, if it's an accounting manager or CPA, engineering, the sciences, getting your PhD. It's something where they're actually going to use what they learned in college and really need to have gone to college to get the job, or, be able to practice in it. So that would be, and it's mostly going to be intellectual when you look at the learned ones, because you're using what you've learned in college. And they're analyzing stuff, they're interpreting, they're deducing, things like that. And it does meet the salary, it has to meet the minimum salary test. Then you have the licensed ones. Now, these have a different kind of salary. As you can see, teachers have no minimum salary. These are people that are required to have a valid license or certificate in order to practice. So someone can't practice law without having, a license from the state they're practicing in. You'll see attorneys who have licenses in multiple states so they can practice in each of those states. Teachers must have a teaching certificate. It can't be like a teacher's aide. It can't be someone who's in the process of getting it. They have to have these things in place before they're made exempt. So a teacher has no minimum salary either, but they do need to have that teaching certificate from the state they're teaching in. Dentistry requires a license, optometry, architecture, if you're the licensed, architecture for the project or the company. Engineering, accounting, medicine. Medicine, again, it doesn't have the minimum salary. So there's really only 3 of these you can see that don't have a minimum salary. And but the medicine does include degreed medical interns and residents, because they've got the degree, they just need the residency to finish getting licensed. And so they are using the stuff. They might be watched over a little bit, but they are kind of thrown out there on their own to do the job. And so this is where it comes in. It's like the license or the certificate plays a huge role there, and that's what's going to qualify them, because you'll find architecture drafters, people who are drawing, designs for working for an architectural firm, who don't have a license, and therefore they can't be exempt. Same with some engineers. Some engineers aren't, you look at construction, they've got to post their license on just about everything. Like, here's our license to do business and be, held accountable. And that's kind of part of it, is if it's requiring a license or certificate, that person's being held accountable for knowing what they're doing. The last one on this one is, well, what did I say? Professional. Oh, artistic. Okay, so I'll get to that one in a minute. Professional exceptions. These people are not considered automatically exempt. A pharmacist, a nurse, physicians who are paid hourly, because they might not be maintaining their license or maintaining it in a different way. I'm not quite sure what a physician needs to do stuff. Nurses, you notice that there's a difference between like I think it's I won't say a PA, but anyhow, they've got different, they have different letters after their names. Some are capable of writing a prescription for you. those people are probably more likely to be exempt, whereas another nurse may not be able to. And, and that's part of it. Pharmacists, the same thing. You usually, a pharmacy may only have one licensed pharmacist, and then he's got, we'll call it the pharmacist assistants or whatever that's, preparing the stuff, but everything's viewed. It's the pharmacist who's the one who has to talk to, if you ever go into like a CVS or, Walgreens and they've got a new prescription for you, it's like, oh, let's go over here and our pharmacist will talk with you about the side effects of this drug or how to take it, things like that. But don't consider the title as an automatic. You have to look at what they're doing. Artistic professionals. Now, I've had a lot of questions on this one before. It's like, oh, I'm a crafter. Can I, do this? It's like, we're talking about, these are people recognized in their field. And, so they are coming up with, they're not copying something. I used to teach lessons at Michael's Arts and Crafts, but I was teaching what someone else taught me. I couldn't be exempt in that role because I was just basically, copying a technique and passing the technique along. But something like, music, writing, acting, graphic arts, some of these people that are making a living by doing this and a decent living, a lot of them, they do need to meet the minimum salary. So if they're working in the field, that's a good way to find out because, there's a lot of poor, artists out there. And, they're always like, oh, they have to be poor and suffer for their art. Well, they can't be exempt if they're suffering because they need to make a certain amount of money. They need to be recognized and actually selling their work. So let's move on to another polling question.
Is a sales rep who spends most of his time doing virtual demos of a product or making calls to prospects from home exempt or from a home office exempt? So we've got some responses coming in now. We're at about almost 20%. Yeah, moving along. We've had some questions come in that were a little specific to the business. Just want to let you guys know that if you do have very specific questions to your business, do feel free to send them through, but I probably will have to wait until the end to answer them. Just letting you know that in advance. And yeah, actually, I do have a good one coming through right now. This doesn't seem too specific. Can artists be paid on stipends instead of hourly?
Well, I assume since we're talking hourly as a non-exempt person, I think it's going to get tricky because with an hourly employee, that you have to pay them a certain time, a certain amount of times per month, because they all have to be paid at least semi-monthly. They have to hit, for the time spent, they've got to at least reach minimum wage. So if your stipend is not covering that, it could be a problem.
I have another question since we have another moment. Is there a place we can find out what the minimum salary for our state is? For example, Oregon.
Yeah, if you just type in OR minimum wage, it will pop up for you.
Perfect. We have about 68% voted. So, and it hasn't moved for a bit. So I'm just going to read the responses. We have 33% that say yes and 67% that say no.
This has been a huge issue in the past year with COVID because bottom line is sales reps have lost their exemption over last year. They weren't considered essential personnel, so they could get out there and do their sales. And frankly, a lot of companies had to close up anyhow and weren't allowing outside people in. But to qualify for that outside sales exemption, there's, they need to be at least 18 years old, which I usually haven't bumped across that one, but they must be spending at least 51% of their time, I call it pounding the pavement, being out there in front of the customer or the prospect. I've got a lot of clients who are doing, I've got some that sell like big equipment to where you can't just tote it along in your briefcase to go show it to somebody. And they do these demos online and then they do a Zoom meeting and stuff. And so they're selling like maybe in the whole state and they don't go out to the client sites and they cannot qualify as an outside sales rep. That might be their title. It's not going to make them exempt. And because they're not literally, and I have talked to attorneys about this so much, and I've got 2 times I have attorneys one was on immigration and that stupid I-9, but the other is on this outside sales. They keep telling me the laws have not caught up to technology. That's their answer. And so what they're saying is, even though everybody's gotten into using Zoom and it's made life so much simpler for a lot of sales reps, they can go and make all their calls, they can do the online face-to-face, they can do all this stuff, but they can't be exempt. And so last year, if you had anybody who was qualifying for an exempt sales rep after, the COVID hit in like last March, up until, things started opening up again, some started opening up again like last fall, but you had the whole summer for sure where they were not able to go out and pound the payment 51% of the time, and they should have been paid hourly. So that's just an FYI, but that's how, and it's a very strong, it's like this has not changed, and no matter what happens, they've said it can't, it can be spent a little bit. It depends sometimes between the state law and the federal law on, they can be part of the setup of, like if you're selling equipment, they can go in and help set it up for you, things like that. But it absolutely does not cover any time they're making those phone calls to sell, to schedule appointments. It doesn't account any Zoom meetings. It doesn't account, when they're sitting and they're in your office or their home office, if they're just sitting there and not in front of a client, it is not counting toward that 51%. And so that is the big one. And in the past, that wasn't necessarily a big problem, but I did start seeing it become a problem because of people starting to move toward the online meetings. And, but keep that in mind, that that's a huge one right there. Okay, got one more polling question we'll do.
Okay, do you have exempt commissioned inside sales reps? And while people are answering that question, I've got a couple for you, CJ. If double minimum wage is offered as salary, should job duties still be reviewed for exemption?
Oh yeah. The money, like I said, the money is kind of an easy black and white one. Okay, check, yeah, they're making enough money. Now you have to look at the duties, because the duties are going to carry a lot of weight. In fact, more weight, because they, like I said, they won't look at a title. They'll glance at the money and either say, well, slap you because you didn't pay enough, or, yeah, that's fine. The duties are what really make it an exempt position, because, you've had to prove and justify that this is exempt. I remember I was working as an office manager for Department of Molecular Genetics at a research institute. And I was being promoted into, I can't even remember what the title was. And they had someone from HR come and spend a whole week with me to be able to track what I was actually doing all week long to know whether or not I qualified as exempt. So it's taken very seriously, and it should be, because those duties are the ones where it has the most controversy, and so you really need to be able to provide a good justification on what level of discretion this person has, what level of judgment they need to use, what authority they've got, things like that.
Awesome, thank you. So for the polling questions, we have 25% who say yes and 75% who say no.
Okay, so an exempt commissioned inside sales rep, I don't advise ever using it, because it's a legal bomb as far as I'm concerned. And maybe it's just because I wanted it to be a little bit easier than this. The only thing the exemption provides you is that you don't pay overtime. However, to qualify, they must receive at least 1.5 times minimum wage. Commissions must be more than half of their pay, and the commission must be paid every pay period, and it has to be for selling, so they're actually making sales while they're on the phone with those people. And on a federal law, it's limited to retail establishments. So if you've got a boutique, clothing boutique, and you've got your inside salespeople there that are commission, then that could work if they're making at least 1.5 times minimum wage, and that commission's being paid every pay period because they're helping sell the articles. California limits it to a couple of wage orders. Other states will have their other, may have other limitations. So you really want to be, that's why I don't like this one. Cox Cable, huge company, ended up in a big lawsuit several years ago because of this, because those people that you call and are trying to sell you their services and stuff, they had them as commission inside sales, but it turned out they were only paying the commission once a month after the end of the month. And that meant they weren't getting every paycheck, half of it, at least half being commission. You have to literally pay that commission at the same time you're paying them for the hours they've just worked in that pay period. If you don't, they're not going to qualify for this exemption. So for me, it's too much of a headache for the benefit. Over time, on, commissioned inside salespeople, most inside salespeople, if you're talking, in a retail establishment, aren't really working much in the way of overtime. So to me, having to do the administrative side of the other part of it is just too much work. But that's me. So you may not feel the same way. Computer-related exemption. It must meet a minimum salary test, but it does vary with that a little bit. There are differences between some state laws and the federal law. A degree is not required, and what they're looking at more particularly is the work itself. So this is not going to be, necessarily your IT manager will not qualify under this one. Might qualify under the manager, the administrative one is a manager, but not going to qualify for this. This is someone who is actually developing systems and programs and documenting and testing it. They're the ones doing the creation, not, the simple little, coder, because they've got to be doing more than that. They're not doing the repair, they're not manufacturing, they're not a trainee, and they're not using the final product. They're creating the product that the company's probably going to sell or develop for themselves. I worked with a medical device company, and we had someone who created the whole software architecture behind the way that the device ran, and that person could be exempt. So you're looking at people who are computer system analysts, they're programmers, they're software engineers, they are the people doing creations and really checking it to make sure it's working and sellable for the most part. Now, when you get to some differences, federal law requires that you meet the minimum salary. That's the federal minimum salary, or based on your state minimum salary. California actually has, and this is because California's got a special kind of exemption for this. And actually, even people that are qualified to be exempt in California can sometimes still earn overtime. It's a weird industry in California, and they came up with some different rules because California often is the tech capital, and Silicon Valley, they had the big .com bust, years back. And so that's when they started coming up with their own special version. And so the minimum salary in California for this particular exemption, and I have not figured out any rhyme or reason, but it usually runs pretty close to a minimum of $100,000 a year you're paying somebody who gets this exemption. And it changes every year. It's like 96,000, 98,000, So somebody who's being paid normal salaries is not going to qualify just based on the money. So what happens when you do misclassify someone? As often happens, the company is held totally legally responsible for misclassifying. You are the ones who are supposed to decide whether that person qualifies as exempt, same way that they make you decide if that person qualifies as a contractor as opposed to an employee. So all the weight is on you. It doesn't matter if this person has been exempt for their entire life. When they come to you, you need to be able to justify it on your own for what they're going to do in your company. Again, title doesn't matter. You can have somebody, it's like, okay, we're going to, I've seen the strange titles appearing which take away from some of the other part of the title, like VP of happiness, VP of corporate togetherness, things like this, where nobody has a clue what that person does. So you really have to look at what the duties are. What is that level of responsibility? What is that level of authority? And you have to look at that, because what happens is, and I've had to sit in front of people before and say, I've put out, like, California can go back 4 years. And so I have had to sit in front of employees before and say, okay, here's 4 years of calendars. Mark every time on here that you think you work some overtime that you didn't get paid for, that you, in California, we have a specific meal break thing that you didn't take your meal break on time. And the California, first thing you're going to do is write a check to that employee for that amount. And the state then is going to take a look at it and say, okay, for 4 years, this person, you've had them as exempt, but they should have been non-exempt based on our audit. And therefore, we're going to look back here and you're going to owe them for all of that time. And since we didn't keep records because we thought they were exempt, so we have no time cards. We have nothing that shows how much they worked, when they started, when they stopped, if they even took a break or even time off necessarily. And so we're going to believe the employee on whatever they say. And California will do that. They're very employee friendly. And so it's harsh. And so you're going to be stuck paying the penalties for having not filed proper taxes on overtime, not filed stuff like, and fines and penalties for having made a wrong decision about this. The employee never has an option. And that's very important to remember, because I've heard that so many times from clients. Well, the employee wants to be salaried and they're okay with being salaried. And it's like, no, they don't get a voice in this. If they really want to be exempt, make them, or they, usually see, and that's the problem, is the employee doesn't understand these definitions. What they really want is to be salaried. They want to know they're getting the same amount each month, and they can tell their friends, I have a feather in my cap because I'm salaried. Somehow they think it is a feather in their cap, instead of the fact that, oh no, here's people who are going to work extra hours and not get paid for it. So it's like, what happens is, you can in payroll, there is, there's different terminology. Legally, we're talking exempt and non-exempt. In payroll, they use the terms hourly and salary. And you could have an hourly person be paid salary, but you have more administrative work to do then, because you have to reconcile that paycheck every pay period to make sure they did get paid enough for the hours they worked. They're still going to do the time card, but they can call themselves salaried. To me, it's not worth the effort, and I will tell people that, no, it's, I want it to be very clear and transparent who's exempt, who is not. So don't just assume that the employee is going to say it's fine and therefore it is. There's a lot of penalties that come up with this kind of stuff. On your state, you're going to have, like I said, the unpaid overtime that worked. That's those lawsuits I mentioned at the beginning. Those are all about the unpaid overtime. These people said they worked and didn't get paid for it. So there might be missed paid rest breaks that they didn't take or weren't told they could take. There's penalty pay in California for missed meal or late meals and stuff like that. There's federal and state fines, because one thing that happens is a lot of times when the state agency gets done with you, they flip you over to IRS, because if you didn't pay certain payroll taxes to your state, you obviously didn't pay them to IRS. And then you're going to have what'll end up probably almost being more than anything else, the attorney fees to take it all through this. And look at that, because when you do misclassifications, it makes it very easy these days to become a class action lawsuit. Oh, well, then let's look at all of these account managers that have been labeled exempt. It's not just the one person who filed or made a complaint. Now it's all of them under that same title. So that's why it becomes very dangerous. So what happens to that employee who said, oh, yeah, I'm fine, being, salaried. I'd want to be salaried. I'm going to be upset if you don't pay me salary. And nothing happens to them. If you misclassify somebody as non-exempt and they were qualified to be exempt, there are no problems. Big deal. Nobody's going to complain except maybe the employee. And that's only because they have to fill out a time card. But there are no fines. There's no anything that goes negative on you because you filed somebody non-exempt. So that's where you start. You start with non-exempt and you prove that they are qualified to be exempt. And so as we're closing out here, I'm always very conservative in this, mostly because I find that people end up not, a couple of years down the road, they haven't given the person the raises they should to keep them above the minimum, and you've got managers who will, oh yeah, we can make you salaried, no problem. You don't want them making that decision for you. You need to make sure that only the people who know how to go through this and talk about it will do it. Most law firms, have like a little form that they'll send you to where you can fill it out and send it into them, and they'll give you their opinion whether or not this is an exempt or non-exempt position. And what they're doing is saying, okay, I mean, it's a simple form. It's like, okay, list all the duty, major responsibilities you have. How often are you having to do that? How much of your time each week or each month is that spent on? And you're looking at that, and they're going to decide, is that task or responsibility an exempt or non-exempt, level? And then they're going to add up how much time they're spending on non-exempt duties versus exempt duties, and whether or not, and which ones are qualified exempt duties. So if you're thinking of going in and doing an audit, I do really think that you should have to, talk to an attorney about it and get clear on that, so that, they can oversee your audit, even though you'll do most of the work, you oversee the audit, so that they have the attorney-client privilege, and that they can also steer you in the right direction and give you some backup when senior management says, oh, no, we want to just pay a salary on that. Because I've had that happen. I have had clients, after we've talked it through and told them, this is not an exempt level position, they're going, well, it's only going to last 3 months, so I think we're going to go ahead and do it anyhow. Or these people have been in it for a long time. I don't want to have to change it now and explain it. And I'll be honest, the best time to do a change is when your minimum minimum wage is increasing, which often happens on a January 1st. So, in the fall is when you go through and look at this and make it so that then I'll tell you minimum wage is going up, and this position is not going to be, at the level we need to keep it salaried. So we're going to convert you over to non-exempt at that point. And, it's not something that's going to hold up in court as your excuse for having misclassified them if you did, but it's a good way to kind of make the switch without it becoming obvious that you made a mistake, because you never want to admit that. And at least not to the employees, because that just is more weight in a claim. All right, I am done. So any additional questions coming in?
Yes, we actually have quite a few. So to anyone who can't stick around, we completely understand, and we'll be sending a follow-up email to the presentation. To those who would like to hear the questions, I will read them off to find my place. Give me one moment. With many employees working from home, what do you use to determine the minimum wage required? Office location or home location?
It's going to be their home location, because some employees did move out of state for COVID, and so now they're working from another state. So it's always going to be where they're essentially working and living.
Very good. And does the medical no salary minimum exception apply in all states?
I won't guarantee that. The federal says that, but you'd want to double check to see if your state has any specific exemption rules like California does.
And also, I forgot to ask you, CJ, would you prefer to answer these questions here, or would you prefer to answer them via email?
No, I can spend a few minutes, answering some of them.
Okay, let me know. All right, and can teachers receive the annual minimum wages within 10 months? That means 2 months without paid. Will they be overtime exempt?
Yeah, I think with teachers, they should be fine, because it's known that for the most part they get summers off until we get to year-round schools. But, as long as throughout the year, they do have a monthly, but it depends on, I think some depends on whether or not you're actually having them do stuff during that summer months. Sometimes, I know private schools sometimes will have them come in and doing things, and so they need to have it stretched more over all year long. But if you're, in a public school that just flat closes down and there's nothing to do until it comes closer to school opening up again, then that would probably be fine, as long as you can show that they didn't make it for the time, we'll say for the time period worked, they made the minimum.
Okay. Is a facilities manager making the minimum salary but supervises only one employee exempt?
I'd say it's probably going to be unlikely. Part of it because he's only got one person reporting to him, but also because he's doing probably the same work as the person who's reporting to him. And, he might like, oh, go change the light bulbs over here for this guy. But, he's doing some of the work. If he were doing management as far as calling in outside vendors to come in and fix things and is truly managing it instead of doing some of the work. So it really kind of depends, again, on what that tasks are in that particular one.
Okay, and our project manager is considered exempt.
Most seem to run into the exempt level because they do have they're responsible for maintaining the budget on a project. They're overseeing the whole project and managing. They might not be listed as actual manager for a person, but they often are managing the team that's doing the project. If it's a project manager who is not running a team, maybe less so.
Can you pay a commissioned and hourly paid sales rep less than minimum wage?
A commissioned, okay, is that an inside sales or outside sales?
I don't have the specifics. Pay.
Okay, so if someone actually qualifies as an outside sales rep who's out pounding the pavement 51% of the time, there is no minimum salary. They could be commission only. An inside commissioned sales person must meet minimum wage. Actually, they have to have 1.5 times minimum wage. That's at least half commission and then half pay.
Are small, local, not-for-profits held to the same standards as for-profit businesses?
Yes, unfortunately, they are.
Are data analysts or data scientists covered under the California Computer Professional Exemption?
Again, it's a title. You'd have to look at what the duties are. I would think a computer scientist sounds like it might be someone, but it really depends on what they're doing. California is very picky about that, so I would look carefully if that person's in California.
What kind of situation would there be an exempt hourly employee?
Well, an exempt hourly employee. Okay, what I'm hearing is that someone is qualified as an exempt person, but you're paying them hourly. So technically, if you're just paying them hourly, they're just non-exempt, period.
If the company finds an employee has been misclassified, how far do you recommend we go back?
It depends on what state you're in. In California, I would like to look back 3 years. In California, they can go back 4, but they're too busy, so they've only been going back 3, but that's going to be your target area of trying to fix it. And sometimes you can actually, this is what I use an attorney for, is to just do an agreement like, oh, it's classified, do we want to fix it? We're willing to just pay you, and it's like a negotiated amount. We'll pay you $10,000 to sign off on this thing saying that we're all clear, even Steven for now, and it takes it off of the table for the person to be able to file a claim.
Having a hard time understanding this question, but I'll try to say it the way it's written. Can an exempt staff enter the hours worked into the system? They enter more than 8 hours a day. Is this an issue?
An exempt person does not get paid overtime, and sometimes in certain companies and certain positions, they do track their hours for job costing. Like, okay, we need to charge the client for the time you spend on the project, so we need you to track your time. That's the only reason you really want to have an exempt employee tracking their time. But they don't get paid overtime for it. So no, it's not a problem as long as they're getting the work done. An exempt person, you really are looking at just job performance overall, not the hours spent.
I do think we have quite a few more questions. Do you think that it would probably be best to answer that via email, or
well, I can give it like another 5 if you want, or you can just send them to me by email. I'll leave that up to you.
All right, let's keep the ball rolling. Okay, it sounds like we're not going to get to travel time at all. Is there anything that can be sent out to give us more information about paying non-exempt travel time? Or if you have info for it.
Well, non-exempt travel time is not part of the exempt, non-exempt question. Non-exempt is paid for travel. I mean, that's just bottom line. And the feds talk about it, IRS talks about it. So I'd say start with what your state laws look like. And if you've got an HR person or an HR consultant who can look it up for your state.
Okay. Not sure if this is within the purview of this presentation, but can we have different PTO policies for exempt versus non-exempt employees?
Yes, you can. As long as there's a clean distinction, you just can't have it be discriminatory. So you can't say, well, these exempt, but not these exempt, but as long as you're saying, yeah, exempt versus non-exempt, absolutely.
If an exempt employee works more than 50% of the regular staff in a week, do they lose the exemption for that week?
Not automatically. If it was an unusual week, like maybe somebody's, the manager is chipping in because somebody's out on vacation, they're not automatically going to lose it just because they're filling in that week. You want to look at the bigger picture.
How many years can an employee back claim? I'm sorry, let me wrap my head around the question. Hang on, how many years? How many years can employee back claim when employer misclassifies it as exempt?
Well, they could go back for their whole history and try it. Some laws, but as you saw in those lawsuits I mentioned, it's like the court was actually going to go back 8 years at the time it was in court. I mean, going back to 8 years to 2010 on that one case. So the court can help actually go back a little bit further than maybe some of the laws would allow. But typically, we're talking the difference of someone getting paid properly. And there's not a lot of laws that are going to protect a company for not paying properly for any length of time.
What if the person has paid sick leave and the person is exempt? Does that person need to use his or her sick leave, or can he or she take the day off and get paid for it?
I prefer to use the sick leave. Some of that's going to be a company policy. I prefer to use the sick leave because sick leave has certain protections when the state laws have, sick leaves involved. So I'd rather they use that up before we go into something that doesn't, and, save it so that the protections disappear if things happen down the road where the person still needs more time off.
Can a part-time non-exempt employee be paid both an hourly rate for normal duties and paid a stipend for things like attending training?
No, there should be no stipend. If you're requiring them to attend the training, you must pay them for the time, not just a stipend. You could pay them more, like an extra bonus for going to the training, but you can't pay them less than what they would have earned had they just worked that time.
Actually, our last question. There were a few that were specific to their business, and I will forward those questions directly to CJ. So this is the last generic question. Our company is in California, but most of our employees work and live in different states. Do we need to follow California exempt guidelines or the state that they live in?
No, when an employee moves out of state, you have to look and make sure you're following the law in that state. Now, California, I do say that as a rule, California's laws, are stronger than most any other state, or location. So if you're following California law, it's hard to go wrong in another state. But you do want to just double check to see if a particular state has anything special that is better than California.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, CJ. Appreciate you going through all those questions. So thank you for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. Thank you, CJ, for your time and expertise today, and we hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of their time. Be sure to join us on September 14th for Managing Difficult Employees, 15 Types of Employees Who Challenge Us. So thank you and have a safe day, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.